Hello, and welcome to another Pilates Hour. Really happy to be with you today. Thank you all for joining. And these are some of my favorite webinars to do is the exercise breakdowns. This, as you know, it's really my favorite thing is to help people understand and do the exercises with more ease, feel better about it, less struggle, all of those things. And for teachers, how to then, I tell somebody and they tell two people and two people and really spread the idea of with this exercise or really with any exercise, this idea of curiosity is how can I think about a movement in a different way? How can I approach a movement in a different way? That'll eventually get us to the end product that we want. So in this case for today, that's the roll up. So we're going to be looking at the roll up. It is one that I get questions on all the time, all the time. And funny enough, it's one of the exercises that for me is not so easy. I really have to be working at the roll up quite diligently to just be able to lie down and do it without warming up or without thinking about it, where other people really can just do it anytime. And I think we all have our biases, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in today's presentation about which bodies naturally do the roll up easily and which bodies might struggle a little bit, more. So we'll talk all about that. So the roll up exercise, we have many different versions of it in our Pilates apparatus work and the Pilates mat work. And it's sometimes referred to as the roll up. It's sometimes referred to as the roll down. And if you know and you've worked with me before, when we're doing the roll down, I actually prefer that it's called the roll back. Because sometimes when we're thinking about rolling down, we're literal and we go down and we get short and kind of crumpled in our torso. So if you've heard me say that before, I'm still still saying it because it's a good reminder of how the body's going to move. So on the mat, though, it is typically called the roll up. So why is it so challenging for people? A few reasons, and let's explore some. So one is I think we have the wrong interpretation, or maybe not wrong, but maybe not the best interpretation of what's involved in the roll up. So when you ask people, or you say, can you do the roll up, or you're teaching it in a class, and somebody says, oh, I can never do the roll up. I'm not strong enough. And for a long time, I heard that and I went, yeah, okay, that makes sense. You're lying down, you can't get all the way up. Yeah, it's probably a strength issue. But as I began to learn more and as I began to move more and watch people and even study some other disciplines, like doing a little bit more gyrotonic and gyrokinesis, getting a little bit more into yoga and really exploring more movement, we all started to come to the realization that it's actually not about strength. I mean, yes, you have to have abdominal musculature there working so that you can roll up because they are the prime movers. But usually, the reason that people can't roll up easily or very successfully or very smoothly has more to do with mobility. So, the more mobile our spines are, the easier it is for us to change our shape and roll up and down. It's almost when I think about this, I think about when Joe named the short spine massage, right? We go into short spine. Well, the spine really isn't any shorter, but it is curved. So it's not straight, it's curved. And so it is literally shorter in that shape. And that's what's happening in the roll up. So when we can get the weight of our head starting to come over our thorax, then it's that peeling away from the mat feeling, as opposed to lifting something quite long, a long lever through space. And I love to use my spine, my origami spine, to show this. So this is the head, let's say, and this is the pelvis. And if you're one of those people that likes to be accurate, this spine has more vertebra than you do. So don't write to me after and say your spine has too many vertebra. I'll take extra ones. So when we're here, if this is the head and I can curl appropriately, the weight of my head and then the weight of my shoulder girdle starts to come over the rest of my body until I can roll up and I can go maybe into, depending on the version that you're going to do, into the spine stretch, or you could roll up to sitting tall. But that initial getting off of the floor has everything to do with thoracic mobility and the chest lift exercise. That's what we call a small curl up. So that's that. That's one vertebra. When we talk about vertebra by vertebra, we're not talking so much about them touching the mat or not touching the mat, but we are talking about them moving one on the next, on the next, on the next, on the next. So we have this shorter lever to move through space. And I contrast that with my roll down bar. So if I tied something to the end of it here, it's almost the same length as the origami spine, and I started to lift it up this way. That weighs a lot more, right? As I'm moving it through space than when I can bend it. So that's one of the first things that I really look to, is making sure that the person has the right idea, the right image, the right picture about what this exercise requires. What's it about? And once we can get that through, then we can be much more successful. You've heard Brent talk about strategy, 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 right? 99% of the time, I find that strategy or a poor strategy is what enables somebody to do something with ease or might struggle a little bit. So it's always worthwhile to make sure when you're teaching that you're talking about ease, you're talking about fluidity, you're talking about mobility and peeling and showing those images, because that image, as the old adage, picture is worth 1,000 words. If you were maybe just to show a spring curling that way, or take the edge of your mat and roll it back down, that image is huge for people. It doesn't work all the time. It's not always enough, but at least now they're operating from the right starting place, right? They have the right intention. So let me put this back. All right. So chest lift, again, for us in Polestar, we start lying in supine. We do a small curl up. We use the legs, so the hands behind the thighs, to assist curling deeper. And this is something I'll suggest for you when you're cueing either the chest lift, a roll up, assisted roll up, any of the supine exercises that require that partial roll up, the 100, single leg stretch, double leg stretch, all of those, is that we think about and pay attention to the language we're using. And again, what's the next image that we're going to impart to our students? Quite often, people have done a crunch in the gym, right? We've done it in school, we've done it, when we've been working out, we've seen people do it. And basically, to me, it's get up off the mat some and come back down. There's not, at least my experience is, there's not a lot of instruction on how. It's just complete the task of come up and go back down. And I think we do a much better job in Pilates of giving people a little bit more of the how and the why, like what's involved here. So one of the next images is getting to curve deeper in the upper chest. And that's tough because we've got a lot going on there. We have the ribs, they're quite close together. We have collarbone, shoulder blade, sternum, all these different bones and places in there that can be and is often a bit rigid or it doesn't move quite so much. And I always look for the word supple. Like, is your spine and is your rib cage supple? That would be something that's an attribute I'd be looking for. So when we can get that feeling of suppleness and we're not so concerned about getting up, but we're more interested in changing the shape of our spine, then we've got something. So other ideas when we're using the arms, one of my um, the things that I comment on quite a lot when we're doing anything with hand assistance behind the thighs is people are reluctant to hold on. Like we've almost been conditioned that if we can't do it independently in our own bodies, that, well, too bad, you just can't do it. But yet I'll go onto the trap table and I'll use the tower bar or the springs for assistance, but I won't use my own legs and arms for assistance. So I don't know why that happens. It does. Until I can get people to understand that when you use your arms against the kind of almost the holding or pushing away of your legs, that moment gives you the opportunity to kind of sink the lower ribs back, to curl a little bit deeper, and set yourself up to start working on that mobility. And then you can let go, you can do all the choreography there, you could start another exercise there, but at least you've given yourself a really good, mindful starting position, even if you can't hold it, because that's the challenge. Yeah, it's sometimes easy to get into the starting position, but it's a little bit challenging to stay there. So that's okay. That's the beauty of some of our mat exercises. That's why I love single leg stretch. Yes, it's confusing which hand goes where and all of that. But at the end of the day, you could even cross your hands and put them on top of your knee. And you can use this, I love this for beginners. You can use your leg to help get you into that deeper chest lift. So make sure your languaging is around that. And it's so easy to say lift up, right? Because you're lifting your upper body up off of the floor. But then watch. So if you say that, it's okay. But watch what your students do. And are they literally lifting up, or are they changing the shape of their spine? So another key area is the back rib cage, the back lower, middle to lower ribs. And if that can feel like it's melting into the mat or expanding into the mat, now you've got a place where your skeleton is being held up, right? I'm not using my muscles. I'm actually using the mat to support me so that I can do something else somewhere else. And that's an important place as well. So I find that chest lift I think it's underutilized sometimes. I think it really can be powerful for us. And then I go the next steps and I do chest lift prone. And I talk also about chest lift in side bending, where we really are looking at the ribs separating a little bit. And no, they don't so much, right? You're not changing it so much, but there is that sense of opposition. And when you listen to Brent talk about the rule of ribs, right? There's all these ways that we're using opposition in our bodies to create movement. And so if the upper ribs and the lower ribs move together, right, nothing changes, right? They move through space, but there's no opening, right? And so we want that sense of opening of the ribs in the front when I'm doing pre-swan or prone extension, or for me, prone chest lift, when I'm doing a side stretch, maybe a very basic, not even really a technical mermaid, but just a side stretch. I want to make sure that I'm thinking about my lower ribs moving down, so I'm getting the mobility in my ribs and spine. And then, of course, in the regular chest lift and supine going into flexion. So any movement anywhere in your spine will help with movement in other directions. So we don't need to be limited to just working on flexion. We can work on movements in extension, we can work on movements in lateral flexion or side bending, and also in rotation, so that we're really conditioning the tissues and conditioning the joints, right? It's like we're giving them this opportunity to move and lengthen and slide on one another, we have that. Now we can start to incorporate that when we go into the roll up. At least it's going to be something, it may not come immediately, but it's something we can access because we're going to remember back to that. The teacher is hopefully, when you're teaching your classes, you're going to be reminding them how that was. Expand the back lower ribs, keep the back lower ribs on the mat longer, and then allow people to go through that motion. So that's important for really for movement in any direction. So I love to work on the other directions to then help the direction that I want to improve upon. All right. Um, some other things that will affect it, and I mentioned this in the very beginning. Which bodies tend to do a little bit better, which bodies tend to have a little bit more of a challenge. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but we can look at people's proportions. So if you have somebody who has longer legs or bigger, more muscular legs, heavier legs, we can kind of think for that group of people, this might not be so challenging because they've got some weight there, some heaviness into the mat, and the pelvis is part of that. And then the spine has something to move against. And we need to have stability or control in certain areas to provide the opportunity to have mobility in other areas. So in the roll up, one of the places where we want to have control is down lower, right, relative to what's moving. So if I start to move my head, I don't really want my pelvis to move at the same time because I'm almost meeting myself. It's like I often will say this, like I'm meeting myself coming and going. So I'm starting to roll up through my head and shoulders, yet my pelvis has started to roll back this way. And that's confusing, right? Do you want to go this way? Do you want to go that way? What's happening? So we need there to be a little bit of stability or control at the pelvis. That doesn't mean engage all your muscles, right? Because if you engage a lot of muscles, all the muscles are going to engage a little bit more. It's like a carryover, and then the body stiffens a little bit. So we just want it to stay, right? It doesn't have to do much, it just has to not move. And so as I roll up, I can let that happen. And then eventually my pelvis will move and I will come up to sitting, or I'll go into spine stretch, into the whichever variation you're going to do. The same thing on rolling back down or rolling back. So the pelvis is going to move first, right? There's a sense of rolling back through the pelvis. You're going to get all the individual parts of the sacrum. You can imagine maybe they're not so connected, they're not fused together. So you have a few more segments you can move from until you get all the way back down. And that's a helpful way to kind of think about it. So one part is not moving to allow another part to move. And this happens in movement everywhere. And that'll be helpful for your clients and for your students and for you if you struggle with this as well. One of the things we can also kind of look at is energizing the legs. Now, people get confused. We get comments often about, oh, well, you say don't cue muscles. And inadvertently, we are cueing the muscles when we cue a task, but we're not identifying, okay, now engage your quadricep muscles, or now engage your gastrocnemius, right? Clients don't know where those muscles are, and it's out of proportion and out of context with the other, 30 or 40 muscles that also need to be doing something. So when we're cueing a task or we're cueing with an image, it is sending a message somewhere, but it is sending the right message to the entire area, the entire group of muscles. So energizing the legs is something that I will often talk about, and a little bit down. And you guys know my affinity to cue something that gets the hip extensors to be a little bit active when we need that stability. So one of the things that we'll often look at in a roll-up, as somebody starts to roll, how soon in the movement does either their pelvis tilt backwards or their knees bend? And that's telling me that we don't have that sense of energy and control there yet, but we can get there. Okay. So that we started that with the person with longer or heavier legs and the ease to roll up. Now, what if it was the other way? What if somebody had a much longer torso or a heavier torso, more muscular torso, and maybe their legs were a little bit shorter? Now you can see kind of the balance of power has shifted. So my torso relatively is a little bit heavier than my legs. And so this is where sometimes we need to give just a little bit of assistance to people, not because they can't do it, because if you give them just this little tiny piece of assistance and then they can automatically do it, they can do it, right? But it's sometimes the proportions or the awareness or the proprioception isn't quite there yet. So we have a few ways that we can do that in the Pilates studio. People can do it at home as well. And let's go over to the table and we'll show a couple of those just for if you haven't seen them yet or you haven't experienced them yet. Don't worry, we're not doing weightlifting. So many of you have used or seen the little tiny bit of a towel under the lower back. And I'll just show it in case somebody hasn't seen it or you've forgotten about it. A lot of times I watch different people teach and it's like, oh, right, I remember that. That's such a good tip. So something quite small underneath the lower back. And what we're going to do is create a little bit of extra awareness so that the pelvis doesn't tilt backwards during the roll up. And one of the things that I don't hear so much of anymore, but is this idea of taking vertebra by vertebra to a place of pushing the vertebra into the mat. Like you have to get your lumbar vertebra to touch the mat as you're rolling down. And depending on somebody's lordotic curve, if it's even just what we would kind of consider in the range of normal, for somebody to literally get the vertebra to touch the mat, that is a lot of work, and it's a big range of motion that the spine has to move downward toward the mat or toward your trap table, wherever you're doing it. So instead of that idea, what we want to think about is we do have them come down one at a time. We still want the idea of articulation and that vertebra by vertebra, but not to the point where we're pushing them down into the mat, not in the lumbar spine. Okay? So this just gives a little bit of proprioception or a little bit of help with awareness for people to be able to go into it. You'll find the place that is just the place that's not your pelvis. So it's really quite low in the lower back. And it takes sometimes a little bit of kind of futzing around a little bit until you find that place and the pelvis stays until I roll all the way down, as opposed to starting to roll back and trying to get my lower back down and then my knees bend to try to get that sense of imprinting. So the idea of the spine lengthening is great. The idea of the curve lessening is great, but not to the point where we're pushing down. So this can be really helpful for people. It's helpful for me. When I'm moving, it allows me just that little bit of information. And when I continue to use it and then gradually take it away, my roll up is fine and I can do it without. But if I've not been practicing, sometimes I need to go back to this every once in a while just to get that memory back. Here's really where your body needs to be successful in this movement. I mentioned the importance of other motions, doing your chest lift over a ball. Again, nothing hugely new, but I think it's underutilized. I think that we could really do more of working on this fanning open and close of the rib cage. So getting into the point where the shoulder blade area is on the ball. And this happens to be, this is a body rolling ball. This is a Yamuna ball, I believe. I think it is. It doesn't have any names on it anymore. But this thicker material is often nice. So sometimes the Gertie balls, the softer ones that we often have in the studio, those are also fine. For some people, like a body rolling ball or something with a thicker texture is actually helpful. So you can have a few of those around in the studio. But as we go, shoulder blades, now I have that perfect opportunity to have my ribs moving opposite of one another. So my lowest ribs and my upper ribs are moving apart from one another. Now I can really sink my ribs down into the mat or into the ball as I come into the chest lift. So I'm not trying to lift off of the ball. I'm actually trying to just allow my ribs to separate into the ball as I go. And do different motions. I like to add rotation and extension, so coming down to one side, going into rotation on the other side. Sometimes it's helpful to have the leg, the opposite leg, so I'm thinking about getting my ribs over to my thigh. So getting to that type of a motion where I'm not just stretching the muscles, I'm using them and they're active, but I'm also learning what is that like to do these different movements. And when I don't have to come all the way up, sometimes people do a little bit better with that because there's not so much fear of, I'm not going to make it up. I'm not going to get there. And so we're very goal oriented, aren't we? All right. So some other tricks is to add a little bit of weight, which again, when you first hear about it, sometimes you think, well, if I can't independently do a roll up, how on earth could adding weight help me? And again, it's a little bit of leverage. That's how what it feels like to me in my body is it feels like I'm able to leverage and move through areas that I've not been able to move through before. So this added load, and Brent, talks about load all the time. How do we manage load and how do we use load to our advantage? This is one of those times where having a little bit of weight, a weighted bar, many Pilates studios have longer bars that are weighted. It's such a good tool because it enables you to stay down on the mat a little bit longer and go into your movement. I just happen to have a dumbbell here, but you could use anything, a weighted ball, you could use a weighted bar, anything that has a little bit of something to it, you can go into the motion and notice how when you're moving and I get here, now it allows me to move through my ribs in a way that I might not be able to do if I didn't have the weight in my hand. So try that. That's one of those neat tricks where you can share that with your clients and have them practice that at home, where it's like, wow, I never thought about that before. So that's a nice one to use. And then use some other props to manage the range of motion. So this happens to be a balance set. You could have a small cushion. You could use the ball that you used before, a rolled up mat, whatever you have that starts you a little bit up. Spine corrector, another great place, especially the lower arc spine corrector. So you can put something behind you, and now when you're rolling, you don't have to cover the same amount of ground, so to speak. So as I get to here, it's already priming my system to come up. So that's another prep that you can use to get people into the feeling of it. Okay, so those are all things you could do if you were in a studio, only mats, right? You had a few props around, but you didn't have the advantage of having a trap table or a reformer with springs. Now we do, yeah? So let's look at some of the other movements where we can practice some of these ideas. So one of my favorites is, of course, this teaser prep or pre-teaser or roll-up, lots of different names for it, where we're again getting a little bit of assistance, but now I have assistance from the spring. And I want to work on not just doing the movement, because it's great. And I see people, they get on, they hold on, they roll up and down a few times. What we can do a little bit better as teachers is to take the imagery that we had from the mat, right? So the idea of the ribs expanding, the ribs staying down for a moment longer, the pelvis staying in control and not moving, those types of things, we can put that together with our apparatus movement. And now we've bridged that gap. Because sometimes when we give people assistance, and it's pretty easy, right? Now I don't have to do very much to roll up or roll down. I miss that opportunity to connect the dots there and connect those ideas. So that might be something that you can do, is when they're doing these assisted movements, is make sure that you're tying in the ideas from mat work in here, so that when they go back to the mat to be independent, now they can actually have that learning already happen. They recall it, and now they can do it, or at least they have their path to being able to do it. One of the other things to pay attention to, if we're doing a roll up, whether we're doing the full teaser and we're going to get the legs involved, or we're just rolling up with the legs down and the feet on the mat, is what's the orientation to the bar? And it's different than when maybe you're doing the scapular series here. So we have the ability to have the arm in less shoulder flexion or relatively more shoulder flexion. So the relationship of my hand to my shoulder can change by where I am on the table. If you're doing some shoulder rehabilitation, you might want to do some of your scapular work at a variety of different places on the table, so that you're moving the shoulder blades just a little bit differently than just if you started with just 90 degrees of shoulder flexion. So that might be a reason to scoot up or scoot down. If I was to do my roll up and continue on like I was going to practice teaser, but I started from here, which I see quite often where the hand is over the shoulder, so we're kind of at a 90-degree angle in shoulder flexion. And I start to curl up, it's all fine, but now the weight is pulling back, or my assistance is pulling back, and I'm getting way out here, so my help is much more behind me. Now, if I don't need the help, it doesn't really matter. But the whole point of this version of it is to assist people. So you'll often do better if people start farther back. That also puts you, because if I was to do teaser from here, I can't really, because I'm not up where I need to be to find my balance. So it goes onto the teaser as well. So have people scoot back. I always say, get as close to the edge as you can without without falling off. So as you get to this place, now I have assistance going up a little bit farther into the motion. I can still practice that feeling of separation of my ribs. And now if I choose to go up, I'm more in the position that I would be in if I was really going to go into a teaser. And then I peel back. Practice the energized legs. You've all heard me talk about the fifth line before, the concept from gyrotonic. And it's as if I'm standing, if I put the board right under my feet and I'm standing on my feet, this enables me to keep my thighs down, a little bit energized, a little bit long, until I roll up. And the same as I roll back. So the pelvis starts the movement. Until I make my way all the way back down. So that would be just some ideas to put into the pre-teaser or the teaser prep or the assisted roll-up with the tower bar. Now, one thing before we get on to the long springs and do the roll down series there, one exercise, when I ask this in my classes, when I ask this in my courses that I'm teaching, is tell me, and you guys can think about that. You don't have to write it down anywhere, but just think about what comes to mind. Maybe I've already said a bunch, so those are the exercises that are going to come to mind. But name some assisted thoracic flexion or total spine flexion exercises, assisted, right? And undoubtedly, somebody will say, if it's full spine, they'll say things like bridging, which is great. They often will say the roll down series with the heavier springs on the trap table. Sometimes they'll talk about the roll down series on the reformer. Sometimes we get into the pre-teaser that I just did, but often I hear seated push through. And I want you to think about that. If I don't have good spine mobility, right? Maybe my spine has the ability to move, but I don't know how to access it. That again is more of a strategy, right? I've never done it before. I don't know what it feels like. I don't know what to aim for. And then you put me pushing against something like a loaded tower bar with a red or a blue spring. If I don't have access to the mobility, that is not going to help me because I am going to recruit my arms and shoulders, my hip flexors. I'm going to recruit something else where I already do have movement. I'm probably not going to move my spine very much. So if you have somebody who really lacks the ability to access movement in their thoracic spine, I would say leave that exercise a little bit later. So just what that would look like so you know which exercise if you're newer to this. So if I'm going to push down with my arms and then follow, and now I'm having to stretch the spring by flexing my torso, and I don't really have that range of motion, that's going to be quite challenging for me. And that's why you'll often see people bend their knees, not because of their hamstring length, but because they're recruiting their hip flexors or the shoulders go up and different things happen like that. Now, if you do have somebody who has pretty good mobility and has pretty good access to it, a lot of times this does feel helpful. So it's not about the exercise being the right exercise or the wrong exercise. It's more about what does the body in front of you need. So I would say do things like chest lift, the assisted teaser. You could work on the standing in front of the chair, hamstring one, the cousin of, right, in that series you would have washerwoman and things like that. Start standing, then maybe go to kneeling. Kneeling will target the thoracic area a lot more than standing. Standing is more the global body. Kneeling, high kneeling is more in the thoracic spine. I would do things like the roll down series here. I would make sure you're adding in rotation and getting those extra little juicy bits to move. And then later you could go on to something like the push through. It's a great exercise. And this is where I think teachers sometimes we think, oh yeah, when I have that to push against, kind of like when I was showing the weight, right? When I have that extra weight to push against, it feels a little bit easier. Just know that for all clients, that's not going to be the case. So have a backup plan. If you start to do push through and it just doesn't really look like you want it to look, but you want to keep going with the exercise, maybe try something else first and then go back to it. And I think you'll be a little bit more successful there with that exercise. Right. Okay. So we're going to do something. If you want to participate, doesn't take any Pilates equipment, but we're just going to associate the standing roll down with the roll up. And really, if I had a wall, if I had a movable wall, I could just bring it in right to be behind me. If you can imagine it the same as what you're going to do lying down. For a lot of clients, this is the one that really cements or makes the most sense to them of how to get up off the mat, using gravity to help us from a standing position. So if you'd like to have a stand, I'll start down on the mat. You can't see my feet, but that's okay. And in standing, just in your own body, especially if you've been sitting for the last, 45 minutes, is just notice, where does your weight fall? Do you tend to stand a little bit back on your heels? Do you tend to stand with your pelvis maybe a little anteriorly tilted or your ribs forward? Do you have more of the forward rounded shoulders in your standing position? Where do you stand? And then influence it by going a little bit taller and a little bit longer through your legs. And if you can push down from underneath your ankle bones, right? So that fifth line area of almost the area where the heel and the arch change into one another. So that point is a really strong way to deliver movement and force right through the center of the leg and up into the torso. So think about that going down a little bit as you get a little bit taller. And then we talked about, and I mentioned it when the towel was behind the back, is we want to keep the pelvis where it is. I don't need to move my pelvis yet. So I can go through my head nod, right? Nod the head a little bit. Be mindful that it's not chin to chest, because that is maximum in the neck, and I want to have some ease. So just a little bit of a nod. And then see how far you can go of softening, letting your rib cage be supple, your spine be supple. How far can you go until you feel like something around your waist area is going to start to move? Maybe you can imagine the origami spine, right? And the different colors going. And then how long can you wait before you have to move your pelvis? And then eventually, at some point, the pelvis is going to roll over the tops of your femurs, your thigh bones, until you're down. And then we'll go in reverse. So begin with the pelvis and think about it rolling up and on top of your thigh bones, up and on top. And then it's as if each vertebra comes up and on top of the next, the next, the next, the next, the next, until you're standing tall. Do that one more time and be mindful now of letting the weight go too far back on your heels, and see if you can keep that energy pushing down through the ground that keeps you elevated and having elongation. And as you're doing that, I feel like I can see you all. As you're doing that, I know that a lot of people will want or need to bend their knees, and that's okay, as long as it's, for most people, after the pelvis has started to move. Come back up, and then we won't do it anymore unless you want to. You can keep moving, but make the legs feel comfortable, make the spine feel comfortable, and just don't bend the knees until you need to, right? And maybe that's the best thing. Because there are times where the tissues, whether it's the hamstring, the nervous system, other tissue around the actual hip joint, needs to have a little softening, right? We don't need to be on full stretch. So it's fine to bend the knees. Be mindful, maybe I'll show this part. When you do bend the knees, there's bending and tucking under. So just like we talked about, we don't want the pelvis moving toward the head. I'm not doing a rollover, right? If you bend and you soften the knees, let the sit bones also widen a little bit. That way you can soften the tissues there, but you're not influencing the pelvis to tuck under. That would be something that I would watch for on that. So then take all of that and play with it, watch it. It's great to set your phone up and video yourself doing that so you can see what's happening in your body. This is especially important for teachers when we don't have people's eyes on us very often. And then see how that you can incorporate that into what you're doing on the mat. So that would help with that. And I found a lot of people find that helpful, and they find a lot of movement in the lower rib cage area from standing with the assistance of gravity, because we don't need our abdominal muscles to work, right? If we just stood up and fell asleep and somebody pushed us a little bit forward, we'd roll down, right? We don't need a lot of muscular work on the front part of the body. The back of the body is the control part of it, right? That's allowing us to roll forward very smoothly and elegantly. So see if that helps. There is a question. Oh, Nadine. Hello, Nadine. Her question is, how does the shoulder girdle and the scapula merge into the exercise? Such a great question. One of the things that I find often is that we confuse shoulder protraction with spine flexion. And sometimes they do go together. If you're going to go into a spine stretch, there is a bit of protraction that's going to happen at your shoulders, and that's normal. That's fine. But what we wouldn't want to do is only do shoulder movement and not really get any spine movement. So what I'm mindful of is trying to keep the shoulder at the side of my body as opposed to the shoulder rounding in, because that's already going to bias me into not so much of a lengthened position where I have that pliability or that suppleness in the spine. If I'm already starting here, I've kind of lost that movement. So I do want to have the shoulders kind of staying wide as I roll up or roll down, or even in the standing roll down. And this then comes into things like plank. So if you're in a plank, sometimes, and this is why a lot of people, this is not the push-up episode, but it could be, why people often have difficulty with the push-up is because they have protracted their shoulders so much instead of pulling their ribs back where their ribs are now aligned with the head and the pelvis. You've seen that people have that saggy, little bit of saggy rib cage area. So make sure that that's up. And so it's really our job again to make sure that clients know the difference between protraction and retraction and have the ability to flex their spines independently, right? We want both of those areas to move. And then at some point they will go together. So there will be protraction, or if you're doing extension, if we're thinking about mobility in the other direction, you will go into extension, and sometimes the shoulders will retract a little bit. They kind of all goes together. That's all fine, but I would say make sure that you're starting from that most neutral shoulder area where you have some capacity to move. That way, it's like the flavoring, it's like the sprinkles on top. It just complements the movement as opposed to setting us up into a position where we don't have movement to start because we've taken up all of our movement capacity. So I hope, Nadine, that answers your question. But I do see that a lot of this kind of hunched and protracted and a little bit elevated position where we think, again, our proprioception is saying, wow, good job, you really flexed a lot, except we actually didn't. And this is what I will, when we're doing things, maybe at some point we'll do another swan lesson. And when we're looking at the swan, are we looking at the thoracic spine changing shape again? Or are we, kind of mesmerized and we see lumbar extension, but we've missed the opportunity to do any thoracic, or we're just using our shoulders and we're not actually moving our spine. So try to have independent, kind of slightly separated movement everywhere. So I can move my shoulders independently, I can move my spine, I can do all these things. And then I can also make sure that they work together, because that is how the movement will be. We can't just isolate one part or the other. But thank you for that question. Just thinking also about the plank position, and this is what we were doing in standing as well, is making sure, again, that sense of energy or energizing the legs and the thighs so that the thighs are extending a little bit. They're actually not extending, but the extensors are working to, again, provide that sense of support for the pelvis. So sometimes in a plank, it's a little easier for people to feel the sense of pressing the thighs up. And it is that connection point that really connects the legs to the trunk So in your roll up, as I showed earlier, with the feet a little bit flexed and pressing, you can see that connection through the thighs where the pelvis and the legs can stay stable. And that's something to keep practicing. And at first, you'll notice that the feet flex and immediately the quadriceps go, "Ooh, thank you. I'd like to engage now." So a soft flex and more thinking about energy or pushing through the legs. And eventually you'll make that connection. And then again, it becomes very natural. You don't have to think about it or overdo it for that to be really useful. All right, another question. Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Can you remind us of some of the cues you use with regard to splaying of the ribs in the lower back in the chest lift? So I use fan, but maybe some other suggestions. Yeah, that's great. So this would be again in the chest lift. I'll go over. So as I'm going into the chest lift, the cues that I might say when we go into chest lift here, but more so for me, it's when we are using the arms to help and get assistance into that position. So one of the cues that I use quite frequently is reaching the lowest ribs, and you could use this in the front for swan and in the back for chest lift. The lowest ribs are moving toward the pelvis as the upper ribs are coming up and around into the curve. So if I'm going to go into swan, my lowest ribs are going toward my pelvis as my upper ribs are going into extension, and vice versa. My lower ribs are going down. The sensation of going down that creates movement there. Sometimes I'll say, and this makes me always think of Christy, stand through your lower ribs. Again, doesn't matter. It could also be side lying over the spine corrector or over the ladder barrel, right? You could have these same ideas. So stand through the ribs, weight the ribs. I find another place where people want to lift up and away. No. Keep the ribs down. Again, in any of the directions, keep them down. Make some indentation. Sometimes I'll talk about laying on a memory foam mattress. Can you see the indentation of the cartilage in the ribs or the ribs from the back, so that you can have that sense of heaviness there? Because if you can get that, that's going to promote the movement, right? In that sense of opposition. So good question. Those are a few that I use, and I do use the fan. Always happen to have one nearby, so I do have the fanning feeling. In this case, it might look more like this. All right, as I go up and around, these ribs are going to stay, and I'm going to go up and around that way. Yeah, good. Another question. All right, Jing. Could you please elaborate the feet anatomy pushing down? Sure. So I'll just do it quickly. Some of you've heard me talk about this before. So in gyrotonic and gyrokinesis, there is a concept, it's called the fifth line. And it is like it's the center through the leg. And it's our ability to, it's almost like ground reaction force of if you're thinking about pressing through that fifth line, right? It's kind of the center of your leg. If you had, I'll date myself, pants with stirrups on them, or you had your foot strap on from the table or from the reformer, it goes around where your ankle bones are, and where it goes across the sole of your foot, that's where that place is. And it's a very, very good place. If you push on it just a little bit on somebody when they're lying down, you can move their whole body, because it's a direct translation up through the leg and into the torso. A lot of physios will use that to mobilize the body, or people who do body work. So if you can imagine, I sometimes think of a flashlight or a torch beam, right, or a laser or energy going out of that point, then there's something that comes up the other direction. So when I'm pressing through my feet, I'm thinking of that area like shining this broad light. And as I do that, it's going to send energy in the opposite direction. So you can use it in standing, you can use it lying down, in footwork, feet and straps, anything you like. That's the idea behind it. So I hope that answers. Maybe you have a gyrotonic or a gyrokinesis teacher near you, and they can help you with that too. All right, Carolyn, do you recommend doing an exercise working specifically through the thoracic mobility prior to rollback? Nice, good, you got the name. Sure. I was telling my class the other day that a lot of times, because we talk about how we sequence a class and how we, kind of what's the start and where do you end. As a roadmap, we can always change it, right? We could start prone instead of supine, different ways, but here's kind of the normal way, right? If you went to a classical order class, you would start in supine with the 100, right? So we do that, and it is somewhat developmental too. We're lying down, then we get to quadruped, to kneeling, to standing. So we kind of go through all of those motions. And especially if you're doing movement early in the morning, I will almost always do a little chest lift over the ball. I do some kind of easy mermaid type things where I'm moving my spine. I might do some rotation. I might do some book opening where I'm actually rotating the spine where it's supported, and get all the joints moving, and then start into your movement. Now, if you teach an afternoon class, you might not need that. If you're sitting at the computer though, and you think, oh, it's time for my class, or I'm going to go get on Pilates anytime and do a class, and you go to move now, you might again need to do some bridging or do some mobility. It really helps to prime the system. We think of it sometimes as a warm up, and we call it a warm up. It's not really a warm up in terms of what we would do if we were going out and walking or running on a treadmill or riding the bike to raise our core temperature. But it does warm us up in a way, and we can move and create mobility in all the places that we need it before we launch into some of these really challenging exercises. So I would say absolutely. And even if I'm about to start the roll up and we haven't done much thoracic mobility work yet, I'm going to do a few assisted roll up where I'm rolling up and down. And that's another great place. I know we're short on time, but I'm going to show it anyway, since you asked the question. So when you're starting, again, the roll back, I mentioned that the pelvis is what leads. Really practice that here in your roll back, and leave your feet down. Because when we do that, we're telling the hip flexor to lengthen just a little bit, right? We're just giving the information there of, hey, you know what? Leave this where it is and move your pelvis the other direction. So we've already set that up as a pattern in the body. And then keep your feet down. And as you go farther back, just let your feet drag and then pull in. And then you can come back up. If you do your assisted roll up like a teaser, you have told the hip flexor area to hip flex, right? You're going to keep your thighs closer to your torso. For a lot of people, that doesn't matter. They can still do a roll down. They know how to do it. But for beginners, watch out that you have them start their assisted roll down and immediately pick their feet up. Their nervous system may struggle to understand how to roll the pelvis back, and they may end up doing more of that and not feel that area. So just be open to trying some different things with people, see what they need, give them the mobility that they have. Don't make them work for it yet. If they don't really have access to it, give it to them. But then as quickly as you can, challenge them, add a little bit of load or take away some assistance, change the orientation, work in all the directions. And I really hope that these tips and things have helped you or will help you and will help your clients. I hope that they are useful for you. We will end it there. I could go on for hours and hours, but we will end it there. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. It's really always a pleasure to do one of the Pilates hours. Just a reminder, I do have a course coming up in Newport Beach in California in February. You can find the dates on the Polestar website, but it's the last 2 weekends of February that I am teaching our transition course. That is our version of a bridging course. So if you've done a comprehensive training somewhere with any school, really, or you did some Polestar training years ago and you want to brush up on things, please come and join us at the transition series that's out in Newport Beach. All right, everybody, have a great day, and we will see you on the next Pilates Hour.